Hey, what's up? It's Sep from Unison and welcome to the Unison MIDI Wizard preview series. Now in this special 3-part video series, I'm going to be sharing with you exactly how to make your music radio worthy and how to finish tracks quickly, consistently, and predictably. So not too long ago, we did a survey from our audience of 160,000 producers, and the two most common challenges that they told us about that they were struggling with is number one, not being able to make good chord progressions and melodies. And by good, I mean chord progressions that are captivating, that invoke emotion in your listener, tell a story, and are interesting and not bland. And by good melodies, I mean melodies that are catchy, that make people want to play your song on repeat, that get stuck in their head and make sense and don't confuse your listener. And the second issue they were having is hitting a brick wall halfway into a song, not being able to finish tracks, kind of losing interest and inspiration, not being able to really have the output that they want, resulting in a situation where they would have hundreds of unfinished projects on their hard drive, gathering dust, never to see the light of day, and never really making an impact on people. So in this video series, I'm going to share with you key strategies to demolish both those issues so you never have them again. But first, let me quickly introduce myself, because I think especially in music production, it's very important that you choose carefully who you learn from and take advice from, because if you learn from somebody who doesn't have the results you want, the best they're going to be able to teach you is to get their results. And if their results are subpar, then there's really no point. It's going to be a waste of your time. So I'll tell you what I've accomplished. And if you feel like my results are something that you would like to replicate or even surpass, then this video series is for you and you're going to get a ton of value out of it. So again, my name's Sep. I've been producing for over 7 years, over 10,000 hours at least. I have a remix featured on Trap City with over 20 million plays. I have 3 million plays on SoundCloud, 2 million plays on Spotify, 19,000 fans on SoundCloud. I've studied music production at the Musicians Institute in Los Angeles, Art Institute in Vancouver, Garnish, Dubspot. I was mentored by Grammy-winning producer Daryl Swan, and I could go on. And on top of that, I'm the co-founder of Unison. I didn't say all that to brag. As I mentioned before, if you would like to replicate some of these results or even surpass them, then you're going to want to listen to every word in this video series. It's going to be extremely helpful for you. Now, in a moment, we're going to jump inside my computer. I'm going to walk you through that remix I just mentioned that got 20 million plays on Trap City. I'm going to walk you through why it worked, why it resonated with so many people, the chord progression, the melody. I'm going to show you exactly how to implement those strategies into your own music. But before we do that, I want to share with you some quick fundamentals that you have to do if you want to make your chord progressions and melodies solid and radio worthy. So for your chord progressions, if you're making a more aggressive track, you only want 1 or 2 chords that repeat throughout the whole track. But if you're making a more emotional track that hits deep, you're usually going to want a 4-bar chord progression, because that's what lets people kind of loop it in their mind and get familiar with it. But sometimes you can go an 8-bar, and depending on the genre, like for example, in hip hop and pop, it's usually just 4. House music also 4. But if you're making something like jazz or some stuff that's kind of more advanced, like cinematic, you can have very long chord progressions. So we're going to cover kind of like the whole spectrum. And as far as melodies, some things you want to keep in mind is you want to make it predictable, but not too predictable. There's a fine balance, and I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by this in a second when I show you my screen. But you want it to be simple enough so the listener can memorize it and remember it in their head. But every 4 bars or every section, you want a slight variation or an accent sound to break the pattern so it doesn't get stale. And each genre has specific rhythms and proven foundations that the melodies follow. So you're going to want to look out for that as well. And by the way, in this video series, it doesn't matter what DAW you use. You can use Ableton, Logic, FL Studio, Cubase, Studio One. I could go naming them all. But these tricks I'm going to share with you apply to all of those. It's basically fundamentals that apply to all genres of music and all software. So without further ado, let's jump inside my computer. I'll walk you through all these examples and help you really make better chord progressions and melodies. All right, so inside my computer, and the best way I thought I would go about this is to walk you through 2 very successful songs, their chord progressions and melodies. The first one being Beautiful by Bazzi, which is run entirely by an amazing chord progression, which I have remade here. And then the second one being 10 Freaky Girls by 21 Savage, which is run by a very cool melody. So I've gone ahead, got this remade here. We're gonna play these in just a second, but this is the original, and then I've gone ahead, used the exact same sounds, and tried to make the worst possible chord progression I could possibly make, and I think I did a pretty good job at that. So the point of this is to show you the difference between a bad chord progression and a good chord progression. We're gonna do the same for melodies. I'm gonna show you the 5 keys that you need for a chord progression to be good, and the 6 keys for a melody to be good. And after we cover all that, once you get a hang of the difference between a good and bad chord progression and melody, we're going to jump into my remix that I mentioned that has 20 million plays, so we can see everything together in action with a good melody on top of a good chord progression, so you can see what happens when you do that. So without further ado, let's do this. So first I'm going to play the good chord progression, which is how it is originally, and then I'm going to play the bad one, and then we're going to go through what 5 things differentiate these and how you can apply those 5 things to make your chord progressions better. So let's go ahead. So I think you'd agree that sounds pretty beautiful, which is actually the name of the song. And this song has over 450 million streams on Spotify. So as you can see, if you have an amazing chord progression that follows the 5 steps that I'm about to share with you, plus some really amazing vocals, obviously, you can, you have a good chance of making a hit. So now let's listen to the bad one, where I've purposely made it sound as trash as possible. Although it's still going to use the correct notes in the scale, it's not going to follow any of the 5 keys that I'm going to share with you, which is why it's going to sound so bad. And just listen to it for yourself here. All right, so I think you can also agree that this sounds absolute trash. It's not something you would ever want to listen to more than once. So what is the difference between these 2 chord progressions? Well, it's not that they're using different sounds. All the presets are the exact same. The 808, the harp, the choir, the flute, everything's the same. The drums are the same. But 5 things specifically are different, and these 5 things are what I've come to discover over the last 1.5 to 2 years of studying successful songs for making our MIDI packs and all this stuff. And these are the 5 things that we go through to approve our chord progressions and melodies that we put into our packs and other stuff. So number 1 is you have to ask, these are pretty much questions that you can ask yourself, and then basically check it off as yes or no, and then depending on the answer, you need to fix it or it's good. So number 1 is, does it trigger a specific emotion? Number 2 is it memorable and maintain interest? Number 3 is, does it tell a story or paint a picture? Number 4 is there tension and release? And finally, number 5 is it appropriate for the genre that I'm making? So now that you know those 5 things, we can start to see how this one has all 5. This one has none of them. And probably the chord progressions you're making, if you're looking to make better ones, you're probably not going to have none of the 5. You're probably going to have maybe 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4. But knowing these 5 things will help you take your chord progressions from, something that's average. That'll be if you maybe triggered an emotion, it was memorable, and told a story, but there was no tension and release, and it was like the wrong chords for the genre. Then those 2 things you can fix to bring it to that, that radio level. So again, let's listen to this good one. This time with the vocals, so you can see something else is, if you have a good chord progression, whatever else you add to it will make it even better. So if you have a good chord progression, the vocals you add on top, it'll take it to the next level. But if you have a bad chord progression, aka a bad foundation, then the vocals and everything else you add on top of it will actually make the song worse. So now we can see it with these vocals, and pay attention for these 5 things. And then I'm going to go through each one of the 5 and explain how I think it's being done. And then we can move on to melodies after that. So let's listen to this with the vocals again.
Beautiful, 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 beautiful angel. Love your imperfections, every anger. Tomorrow comes and goes before you know. So I just had to let you know.
So that sounds pretty awesome. Now let's look at how bad this sounds.
Beautiful, 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 beautiful angel. Love your imperfections, every anger. Tomorrow comes and goes before you know. So I just had to let you know.
All right, so number 1, does it trigger a specific emotion? With this one, yes, I would say it triggers that kind of love and calming emotion for sure. Like, that's what I feel. This one, does it trigger a specific emotion? No. When I listen to this, I feel nothing. It doesn't move me in any way. It doesn't impact me emotionally. And if your music doesn't impact people emotionally, they'll never remember it and they won't want to listen to it again, because that's really the whole point of music. And there's so many different emotions. It doesn't have to be like love or calm or sadness. It can be like, absolute rage, like some like dubstep songs or something like that. Like, you may think that it doesn't have much emotion, but it's just different. Like, every song that's successful triggers some emotion. One of the easiest ways to do that is through your chord progression. So on that level, that's the difference between these two. Number 2, is it memorable and does it maintain interest? For this one, I'm sure that you can remember how it went and you can remember it. But for this one, you probably have a hard time remembering the sequence of the chords and how it actually went. So when you listen back to your chord progressions, maybe even show it to somebody and ask them these questions, and make sure that your chord progressions are memorable and maintain interest. Because as you can see, even by the second chord, like, let me play this again. Let me turn off the drums here so we can focus just on this. So you'll notice by the second chord in this, you're already bored. So look at this. So it already sounds super boring. I mean, the only case this would be okay is in like some meditation music or something. But we're going to get to that in just a second, where your chord progressions have to be appropriate for the genre you're making. But then compare it to this. Even by the second chord, you're immediately moved and your interest is maintained. Number 3, does it tell a story or paint a picture? Now, I'm sure when you listen to this one, you can kind of, there's a story. It takes you on a journey. That's another way to look at it. It kind of feels like you're in the clouds. You have no worries. It's kind of like you're in paradise. That feeling of love and that you have no worries. Like, that's what it creates for me, at least. And you can kind of get a picture in your head of like what that means for you, right? But if you listen to this, it tells no story and it paints no picture. It's just a bunch of random chords. And although they're in the correct scale, the order that they're in and the way that I've put them together makes it so there's absolutely no story or no picture that's painted in your head. So while we're at it, let's go to step number 4 is, does it have tension and release? So did this tell a story or paint a picture in your head? Absolutely not. Did it have any tension and release? No. But now immediately let's listen to this and take these 2 things into consideration. See if it tells a story and paints a picture in your head, and see if there's tension and release, and if so, where and how it happens. And I'll explain it right after this. So I would say the tension and release is these two chords. As you can even see just by looking at it, it kind of takes you up. That creates the tension. And that's something you can do with your chords. You can, the higher the chords are within the same key, the more tension it's going to create. And you can even create more tension by splitting out your chords like this, using the same notes, but moving some of them up an octave. But in this case, it's more compact, which works. So in this case, it takes you up here, right? There's some tension. And then this entire last section is the release. Every chord is moving down slightly until you're fully released here, and then it loops. So that's very important. If your chord progressions don't have tension and release, you're not going to move people in the way that you want. So that's number 4. And finally, number 5 is, are the chords appropriate for the genre you're making? Now, this key you can either follow or on purpose not follow, right? So if you're making pop or R&B like this track, usually you're going to want to use more simple chords. You're not going to want to use chords that are used in like classical music, like, major ninths with sus chords and all this stuff. You want to keep it simple, but if you're really looking to innovate and be unique, then you can purposely use chords from completely different genres to really make something new. But generally speaking, each genre has specific chords that they use, and you want to stick within that frame in order to sound good in that genre. All right, so now that we've covered these 5 things for chord progressions, that you got to make your chord progressions trigger specific emotion, be memorable, and maintain interest. Number 3, tell a story or paint a picture. Number 4, have tension and release. And number 5, be appropriate for the genre you're making. We can move into melodies and go through the 6 keys that you need to have a great melody. And then last but not least, we're going to jump into my remix and walk you through both of these things in action and show you kind of my thought process when it came to making it. All right, so now we're in the 21 Savage project where we're going to take a look at melodies. So similar to what we did before with the chord progressions, I have the original melody created here, something that's worth hundreds of millions of plays. And then I've gone ahead, used the same sounds, but arranged the notes in a way, by the way, using the same bass line as well, but arranged the notes in a way that it doesn't follow any of the 6 keys that I'm going to share with you, and you'll see how trash it sounds. So first I'll play the good one, which is the original. Then I'll play the bad one. And then we'll go through these 6 keys that you can use to make your melody sound closer to, something that's radio or hit worthy. So let's check this out. Now let's play the bad one. All right, so I was cringing while listening to this. I'm happy it's over. So the 6 things that your melodies need to have in order to sound at that pro radio hit level. So a couple of these keys are the same as the chord progressions, but there's some that are also different. So number 1, again, is, does it trigger a specific emotion? This one, the original one, I would say, yeah, it triggers that kind of spooky, maybe even aggressive emotion. The bad one triggers 0 emotion. It's very flat and doesn't do anything like that. Key number 2 is it simple enough to remember easily? Now, on purpose, I actually made this one have this second key because it is simple enough to remember easily. But as you can see, if you only have 1 out of the 6 keys, your melody will still sound like trash. So both of these are actually simple enough that you can remember easily, mainly due to the rhythm. There's nothing too complex going on. You could, after listening to both, remember what both generally sounded like. But now these last 4 keys are what really makes them stand apart. Now, key number 3 is it slightly unpredictable or break the pattern? And what I mean by this is, as you can see, at the end of each section here, so at the end of each 2 bars, there's something different, right? So over here, there's an additional 2 notes added, and over here, it goes higher. But in the other one that I made, it's literally the same thing repeated twice. So in your melodies, every second and fourth bar, or at least every fourth bar, you kind of want something to break the pattern and make it slightly unpredictable, or else people will go on autopilot mode and you won't maintain their interest. And after getting these last few keys down, I'm going to go through everything put together with the chord progression as well as some accent notes, which also help break the pattern. So let's keep going here. So the fourth key is their call and response. So if we listen to this right here, you can see that this section kind of completes this section and this one completes this one. So let's listen to this one more time all over. So you saw those extra two notes kind of put an end to that section, and now let's listen to this one here. So that gives you a sense of completion and it's ready to loop again. You can loop this as many times as you want. It won't get boring for a very long time because it follows the call and response principle. So now we can move on to number 5, which is it congruent to the vibe and sounds? Now, the sounds that we're using, the vibe that we're creating in this song, let me illustrate this fully by activating the vocals and the drums. You know, it's kind of like a standard hip hop vibe, spooky, a little bit aggressive, and mostly dark. So let's hear it with the vocals and the drums here.
Last altercation got 100 rounds in them. All my spots got a lot of bloodhounds in them. Ain't no furniture, it's just a lot of pounds in them. Perk soft hard, and I got the brown in them. What the bomber clock chateau, we don't ramp in them. Edgewood Glenwood Boulder Crest and a helm with them. Got a lot of sticks, you can get stamped with them. Tryna mediate the beef, you get.
So now that we've gotten a feel of the vibe, we can know that this one, the notes that it uses, definitely are congruent with that feel and vibe, but this one isn't. So let's listen to this entire bad melody. Then I'm going to explain the certain notes that make it sound off.
Last altercation.
So as you can see, in general, the notes don't create a dark vibe, and especially these notes here at the end of each 2 bars use a major note, which should never be used in this kind of hip hop song. So let me show you the difference if we change even this one note. So that compared to, you see that difference? Sounds completely incongruent with the genre, but we move it down to this one. Like already the melody's twice as good just because of that one change. So just by asking yourself, are the notes congruent to the vibe of the track and the sounds that I'm using, you can make those kind of shifts until it does sound congruent. Now, the 6th and final key is the rhythm appropriate to the genre? Now, similar to the chord progression where we had to ask ourselves whether the chords are appropriate to the genre, in the case of melodies, it's usually the rhythm, because genres and certain melodies always have similar rhythmic patterns, which usually complement the drums that are typically used. So as we can see, these are typical hip hop drums. So if you use some swing rhythm like jazz, it's really not going to work. So as you can see, that rhythm completely complements the drums. But if we listen to this, it doesn't. Kind of lagging and it really doesn't melt together. So the 6th and final key, you really want to make sure the rhythm of your melodies, first of all, complements your drums and also is appropriate for the genre you're making. But again, you can completely break this rule on purpose if you're trying to make something unique. So you could use a house music rhythm inside a hip hop melody, you know, if you're really trying to switch things up. But I recommend at the beginning of discovering these keys that you follow them. So now that we've covered the 5 keys to great chord progressions and the 6 keys to great melodies, we can jump into my Faded remix project, which got featured on Trap City with over 20 million plays. So you can see all this stuff in action. All right, so now we're inside my Faded remix project. Now, before we get into walking through the chord progressions and melodies, I got to admit that the sound selection, mixing, and mastering is not nearly as good as what I would do today. And looking back, I see a lot of things that could have been improved in that regard. So we're not going to go through the sound selection, mixing, and mastering. But that also shows you that you can have subpar mixing, mastering, and the sounds you choose can be a little bit not ideal. But if you have a solid chord progression and melody, you can make something that is able to get 20 million plus plays. So let's listen to it from the beginning with everything in action up until the end of the first drop. And then I'll go through the chord progression, melody, kind of my thought process behind it, and walk through it real quick. And as I'm playing it, you can keep in mind those 5 keys to great chord progressions that we talked about and 6 keys to great melodies. So let's go ahead and play it.
You were the shadow to my light. Did you feel us? Another star, you fade away. Afraid our aim is out of sight. Wanna see us alive. Where are you now? Where are you now? Where are you now? Was it all in fantasy? Where are you now? We were imaginary. Where are you now? I'm dancing, I'm dancing. Where are you now? I'm not dreaming. The monsters running wild inside me. I'm faded. I'm faded. So lost. I'm faded. I'm faded. So lost. I'm faded.
All right, so let's go through the chord progression. So let's solo this here. And by the way, I forgot to mention all the MIDI files that I've gone through inside this video, including the Bazzi MIDI files, the 21 Savage MIDI files, and these ones, I'm going to put all into a zip folder, which you can download for free. So with that being said, let's get into this. So the chord progression is actually very simple, and it's one of the most commonly used chord progressions in hit songs. You really can't go wrong with this. Let's listen to it. But even though it's simple, you can see that it does follow these 5 keys. It triggers a specific emotion. It kind of makes you a little bit sad, then happy. It kind of plays with your emotions a little bit. It's memorable. I'm sure you can already remember it after even listening to it one time. Does it tell a story or paint a picture? I would say yes. Does it have tension and release? Yes. It kind of creates tension in the first half, releases in the second half. And also, is it appropriate for the genre? And the answer would be yes, because this is kind of like a pop/future bass track. So this is an appropriate chord progression and chords to use in this. All right, so now let's take a listen to the melody. And I want you to pay attention, especially here, to see if you can identify which of the 6 keys are happening. So let's take a listen. So if you guess correctly, this would be key number 3, which is it being slightly unpredictable and breaking the pattern. So breaking the pattern can either be done inside 4 bars with just a quick accent note, or it can be done very obviously like it's done here, where the entire first bar of the melody changes to go from an upwards note pattern to a downwards note pattern, which really creates a different emotion, takes the track to a whole nother level. And as for the other keys, number 1, does it trigger a specific emotion? Yes. Is it simple enough to remember easily? Absolutely. Number 3, we just talked about, is it slightly unpredictable and interrupt the pattern? Right here it does. If I had copy pasted this exact melody twice and I'd missed key number 3, the track wouldn't have done well. And just actually, let's take a look at it like this with everything in action, just so you can see that around here, you're going to start to get bored and lose interest just because I'm missing key number 3.
Where are you now? I'm dancing, I'm dancing. Where are you now? I'm not dreaming. The monsters running wild inside me. I'm faded. I'm faded. So lost.
So I bet if you're like me, you just got bored right there. And that's because we didn't switch up the melody or break the pattern. So that's a very important key when it comes to making great melodies. Now, key number 4 is their call and response. There is. So the first section of the melody would be the call and the second would be the response. So here you go. So that would be the call, which it kind of goes up and leaves something unanswered. And this section, it will be the response. So number 5 are the notes congruent to the vibe and sounds used. So I would say yes, based on the fact that it really follows the chord progression nicely. For example, if we swapped it around to maybe go back to the root note too much, there wouldn't be nearly as much emotion. So let's take a look at this. So this would actually be a decent harmony, but for the main melody, like the notes that I used are much more congruent to the vibe and the sounds. And last but not least is the rhythm appropriate for the genre. Now, because this is kind of like a future bass song, these long held out notes work really well. Just to show you, if I had used kind of like a choppy rhythm, like something like this. So that definitely sounds really whack, but having these long held out notes, especially because the bass and the chord progressions are also held out, this worked really well. All right, we forgot to change that note back. All right, so that's it. I hope that through these 3 examples, you learned how to make your chord progressions and melodies better. Your chord progressions by following the 5 keys of triggering a specific emotion, making it memorable and maintaining interest. Number 3, telling a story or painting a picture. Number 4, having tension and release. And number 5, having the chords be appropriate for the genre or not if you're trying to make something really unique. And your melodies by following the 6 keys of number 1, also triggering a specific emotion. Number 2, being simple enough to remember easily. Number 3, being slightly unpredictable and interrupting the pattern. Number 4, having call and response. Number 5, having your notes be congruent to the vibe and the sounds you're using. And finally, number 6, having your rhythm be appropriate to the genre, or again, not if you're trying to make something super unique. And again, I've put all the MIDI files from this song, the Bazzi song, and the 21 Savage song all into a zip file organized for you to download, so you can take a deeper look into the chord progressions and melodies so you can get a good idea of what good ones sound like. All right, so I hope that was helpful. I hope you learned some awesome strategies on how to make better chord progressions and melodies. Now in the next video, I'm going to go through my proven formula on how to finish tracks quickly, consistently, and predictably. This strategy that I've developed over the last 2 years really makes it concrete and step by step. And the way I've been able to develop this is over the last year, I've been studying every genre, the top tracks, exactly what elements they have, and the common threads and patterns. So basically I've dissected that, and I'm going to share with you a strategy that you can use to really finish your tracks consistently, predictably, so you never have to be confused at any stage in the production process ever again. Now, if you enjoyed this video, I would love to hear from you. Please leave any questions you have in the comment sections below. I'll be going through and answering them personally, so if anything was unclear, if you had any additional questions, leave them below. I'll answer them, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.